Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hope and Healing Center / CARES monthly Lunch and Learn. For those of you who are not familiar with the Hope and Healing Center, we're a mental health outreach based in Houston, Texas. And this Lunch and Learn series is sponsored by the department we call CARES, for Caregiving, Aging, Resilience, Ethics, and Spirituality. And we're really excited today to have Dr. Andrew Childress joining us from the Baylor College of Medicine. Andrew and I go back a long way. I won't say how long because I don't. Andrew used to be young. Compared to me, he still is. Anyway, he's got his doctorate in the humanities from the University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston. And when he finished that program, he did a fellowship at UTMB. And since then, he has been at the Baylor College of Medicine, where he is co-director of the Humanities Expression and Arts Lab, an assistant. He is an assistant professor and teaches in the college. And he also does ethics consults. So I'm really excited that Andrew is joining us today to talk about Storytellers at the Bedside and to tell everyone about narrative medicine, which to me is a very exciting piece of medicine that's growing. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew and let him do his thing.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Peggy. And it's good to see you again. It has been an undisclosed number of years, and it's good to meet everybody. So as Peggy was saying, I teach medical humanities and narrative medicine to all kinds of learners at Baylor. My primary job was to do clinical ethics consultations, and I've kind of switched a little bit to focus on HEAL in the last couple of years. And I'm really excited about the opportunities to grow that program. So I'm going to talk a little bit about narrative medicine. I'm also going to kind of talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing with HEAL at Baylor College of Medicine. And again, the HEAL stands for the Humanities, Expression, and Arts Lab. And if I were to really try to describe the medical humanities, as Peggy knows, we'd be here another hour. So we're just going to focus on mainly narrative medicine. So every talk that I have ever given at Baylor and elsewhere has to start with objectives, because I want you to get certain things out of my talk today. And here's an idea of kind of what I hope you will learn and walk away with. But the general idea is that narrative medicine offers a very different approach to clinical care that is a little bit more patient-centered than maybe some other approaches. But also, narrative medicine has benefits for physicians. And when I say physicians, I mean healthcare providers of all stripes, your respiratory therapists, your nurse at the bedside, even your radiologists and your pathologists, who don't tend to see patients too often, but are still involved in kind of some of the narrative medicine activities and ways in which narrative medicine can benefit patients. So here's a couple of the ideas that I want you to walk away with. But the big idea is one that you're probably already familiar with. And that is the idea that stories are all around us, whether it's a podcast, a favorite movie, music, going to the art museum. Stories just kind of permeate our culture. And they all tell stories in different ways. And I think it's probably fair to say that across cultures and time zones, human beings learn and grow by telling each other stories. So that's kind of just, I'm going to accept as a basic fact. You're welcome to dispute it, and I'd love to hear your comments if you think otherwise. But I'd also say, and I'd also add to that, that medicine is essentially a storytelling practice. If you think about any kind of history you might have given to a physician before, or if you're a physician yourself, history you've taken, it's a history, it's a story of illness. It's a story of how life may have gone wrong in some way related to changes in biology and things of that nature. So we're sharing stories constantly in medicine, and Rita Sharon and others recognize this kind of fundamental truth, if you will, about the practice in the late 90s and coined the term narrative medicine in 2001. She heads the flagship program at Columbia University in the division of narrative medicine. And according to her, narrative medicine is clinical practice fortified by the knowledge of what to do with stories. In other words, stories like the ones shared in books or stories shared in the doctor's office. And what we try to do is train the next generation of healthcare professionals to know what to do with stories. So what does that mean? It means that we want them to learn to recognize their own need to listen to patients' stories and the patient's need to feel heard. For example, when Sharon would practice medicine, she started the initial clinic visit with every patient by saying, I have to learn as much as I can about your health. Can you tell me whatever you think I should know about your situation? And then she would sit back, wouldn't type notes on a computer, wouldn't scribble things in her notebook, but would just give the patient her full attention and listen until the patient stopped talking. Now, can you imagine that kind of scenario taking place in modern medicine? It's kind of hard to fathom. Hopefully you've had experiences like that, but that's really kind of at the heart of what we're trying to instill in our learners, is this ability to recognize stories and all their complexity, what's being seen, what's being said, what's not being said, and then to absorb that story by allowing for silences, by asking open-ended questions instead of closed ones, like, do you have depression, things like that, which is all part of the kind of medical interview. But Sharon wants us to kind of go beyond that and really find kind of the meaning, the patients attaching to their story of illness. So it involves this process of absorbing, involves attending to multiple narrative threads, tolerating ambiguity, which is really hard in real life, as it were, but also in clinical practice for a lot of physicians and medical learners who are still in training. And thinking about how what the patient is telling you about their current condition is connected to other, if you will, chapters in their lives. And then as she's absorbing, she's then thinking about how to honor that story by offering interpretations that are always tentative and kind of partial, and letting the patient clarify if needed. So she might say something like, thank you for sharing your story. This is what I'm hearing you say. Is that correct? Or could you tell me a little bit about what X means? Or when you said Y, I wasn't quite sure I understood. Could you tell me a little bit more? So asking for clarification, asking for more of the patient's story to help fully understand as best one can the other person's experience. And then being moved to act based on what's been told. So it's not necessarily stories being shared just for storytelling sake, but so that something can be done at the end of the day. And to do all of these things well, she talks about narrative competence as something that physicians and other healthcare providers need to develop. So what is narrative competence? Narrative competence involves close reading and interpretation of complex text. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, how one becomes a close reader. And it involves learning to balance some emotional involvement as well as some necessary level of detachment with the text, with the patient. But it's a very tricky balance to strike. The second component is the ability to reflect and retell complex narratives. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about what that means a little bit later on. But it has to do with recognizing complex patterns of illness and how illness isn't confined to just one person, but radiates outward into family relationships, into work, into all these other kinds of spheres of activity that patients are involved in. And then finally, empathic engagement with others. We've talked about kind of in medical education, how unfortunately some medical students lose empathy as they progress through their medical training, and how there are opportunities to heal, to kind of help maintain, if not increase, empathy over time. So all of these are three components of what sharing falls narrative competence. And across the globe, educators like myself are trying to teach these competencies in different forms to medical learners of all kinds, and they're often taught through workshops. So here's an example of what we're doing at Baylor. So during their second year following their surgery clerkship, so this is when they're in the OR, observing surgeries, participating in them to some degree. The medical students, after they finish that rotation is what they call it, they have 6 workshop sessions. And during these sessions, they read a published work, and then a facilitator, normally a faculty member, leads a discussion of that work. They will draw attention to various narrative elements like the use of time, space, imagery, plot and character, if they're relevant, all those kind of key elements that identify narrative structure. And then the students and the facilitator, I love this part of this of the workshop, will write. It's called writing in the shadow of the text. So we offer a prompt, and the students, second year students, write in response to it. They can write a poem, short story, a little essay. I've had folks do haiku. I mean, it's really meaningful, really powerful. And we encourage them to share those stories or poems with the group and get their feedback. And this is really where the exchange that takes place kind of opens up new avenues of inquiry and thought. And the students will kind of respond to the text, and they'll share things about their medical education, about their personal lives that are so profound, and that they're not sharing, I imagine, in other spaces in medical education. It's an opportunity for reflection and building community. And they do all of this within about 5 to 7 minutes. So they only have a limited window of time to write these stories or poems and share them. And, you know, some are more willing to share than others, as you would expect. But like I said, the ideas, the emotions, I mean, what comes out of those conversations is just so powerful. And it's not just for the facilitators, for the students as well. We've gotten some really kind of positive feedback about that. So they get to practice their writing skills, their reading skills, and their vulnerability, really, which is something that's not necessarily recognized in other spaces in medicine. So yeah, they get about 9 hours of that total. So here is an example of a poem that we read in class, and I'm going to try something daring and foolish and try to share it with you. Let me check this. All right, I'm going to try this. This is called Meditation on Grapefruit.
Meditation on a Grapefruit by Craig Arnold. To wake when all is possible, before the agitations of the day have gripped you, to come to the kitchen and peel a little basketball for breakfast, to tear the husk like cotton padding, a cloud of oil misting out of its pinprick pores, clean and sharp as pepper, to ease each pale pink section out of its case so carefully without breaking a single pearly cell, to slide each piece into a cold blue china bowl, the juice pooling until the whole fruit is divided from its skin, and only then to eat so sweet a discipline, precisely pointless, a devout involvement of the hands and senses, a pause, a little emptiness, each year harder to live within, each year harder to live without.
All right, so I hope you're able to hear that. It's a poem written by Craig Arnold, who tragically disappeared while he was hiking in the mountains of Japan. That's part of the story that we share with students. If you weren't able to hear it, yeah, there you go. Right on, Susan. So it sounds like you were able to hear it. Yes. And that's exactly kind of the response that we get from the students. They're kind of taken by the visual imagery, the sensory images, the description of the cold china bowl, all of that. We really try to get them to focus on how the words are creating those sensations in their minds. And then we talk about kind of all the literary devices and start to talk about, okay, well, you know, and this session is focused particularly on well-being. One of the prompts for reflection, not for writing, but for discussion is that we offer is what are some simple things in life that bring you joy? And if you can imagine medical students kind of burdened by constant studying and very little free time, so I'm told, have a lot to say about that. You know, oh, I used to play the guitar. I used to paint. It's almost always in the past tense, which makes me very sad. But they talk about these kinds of activities, and some of them talk about just getting out in nature and enjoying a hike every now and again. And we also talk about kind of what can they do in clinical settings to enhance their own well-being and what really can help them in their medical education and to stay a little bit more connected to experiences like this. So hopefully the next time they have breakfast, they're thinking more carefully about the bowl of cereal or the egg or whatever that they're enjoying. And, you know, there are certain benefits that we've observed and others have observed. So these narrative medicine workshops have been studied by others, other educators. And basically the takeaway from this slide is folks who practice narrative medicine or, you know, experience these workshops see increases in their Press Ganey scores, which are measures of patient satisfaction, decreases in burnout, increases in empathy. So, you know, there's a growing body of literature pointing to the value of this narrative medicine in healthcare. And now I kind of want to focus on this kind of initial question that you may be kind of turning over in your minds. Okay, all right, clinical practice fortified by the knowledge of what to do with stories. All right, well, what does that mean? What can you do with stories? The writing workshop or the narrative medicine workshop that I talked about gives somewhat of a hint, but I want to delve a little bit deeper into 3 things that you can do with stories and that we teach our medical learners to do with stories. One is to read them, and that is for the purpose of gaining insight into other people's experiences, among many other things. Martha Nussbaum says that literature extends life experience, placing us in a position that is both like and unlike the position we occupy in life. So a little bit of kind of vicarious insight into the experiences of others. We also talk about telling stories and really encouraging healthcare professionals to tell each other stories to kind of build community, as I mentioned before. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but the job is hard and the career is long and the challenges don't stop coming, as you may have heard. And it's good for them, healthcare professionals, to talk to each other, to tell each other's stories as a form of resilience amid the struggles of the workaday world, cope with job-related stress, and also share these stories with the community. I think we're seeing more doctors writing books about the experience of being a physician. I think that's enlightening for those of us who don't wear the stethoscope or the white coat. And then sharing in the construction of patient stories. Now, this sharing piece is really important. Because for a long time, it's been the case in medicine that the physician's story is the authoritative story, and the patient just kind of contributes some portion of that. And obviously, patients don't like to hear that. So the idea is that what's happening in that clinical encounter between patient and physician is the co-construction of a story. It's still the patient's story. It's not the physician's story. but there's a balance in power, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, or at least a more equitable distribution of power, if you will, through that co-construction of this story. So let's talk more about this. So when I say read, I mean it in two senses. I want healthcare professionals to be excellent readers, but I mean it in the sense of physically reading a text, right? Interpreting a chart, interpreting some images, reading words on a computer screen, which is what they do most, unfortunately, a lot of the time during the day. The typing and whatnot is the unfortunate part, as any physician will tell you. So they spend a lot of time with text, but I want our medical learners to look at texts outside of medicine, look at short stories, look at poems for the lessons there. And also learn how to be good listeners. It's so important for physicians of all stripes to be good listeners, reading the patient's story, as it were, as it's being told to them. And seeing patients as a source of knowledge, as a living, breathing kind of source of knowledge that is begging to be interpreted and heard, and recognizing the expertise that patients have when it comes to their own body. So let's talk a little bit about the close reading experience, what I mean by that. So we're reading in order to, in our classes, I should say, our medical learners are reading in order to prepare them for the complexity of communication. If you've ever had any kind of conversation with a healthcare professional, they're often using jargon or talking about phenomena that you don't really understand, and it becomes kind of a one-way street. On the other side of the table, patients don't always say what their physicians want them to, or put everything neatly in the check boxes that they've created through their medical education. So we want them to think about the complexity of that interaction and think about all the kind of narrative elements that I've talked about before, thinking about how time's being used in a patient's story, where they started the story. Did they start with today, or did they start with 5 years ago? And why did they start with 5 years ago instead of the question that you asked them, what brought them in today, right? So why did they start here and not where you wanted them to? There's meaning there, right? And learning to tolerate some of the ambiguity. Patients use metaphors. They use different ways of describing illness than are found, kind of, again, on that checklist. And so physicians need to be able to be open to that. Oh, what did you mean, when you said it felt like an elephant sitting on your chest? Or, tell me more about having a clean plate, at the end of the day. What does that mean? Does that mean literally food, or does that mean, your conscience was clean? So there's so many different ways that people use language, and especially patients, that can be confusing and then kind of written off or kind of put into the medical plot, as it were, without kind of really trying to figure out, well, what was intended by that utterance, as it were. So that's important. Important to be able to tolerate some of that ambiguity. Also registering the details, what the patient's telling you, and not just filtering them all out because they don't fit in the medical plot. Sharon talks about wanting clinicians to be folks on whom nothing is lost. So be someone on whom nothing is lost. And that has to do with kind of being receptive to all those details. And we want them to ask questions. Why is this person telling me this particular story? Like I said before, why are they starting here and not really answering the question that I asked? It sounds like maybe there's something more pressing on their mind than the question I asked them, perhaps, that kind of thing. So narrative medicine places a high value on close reading. And then in this case, I'm talking more about close listening. So the close reader is attuned to all these different narrative elements, like in the meditation on the grapefruit, all those rich sensory details, right? How are they conveyed through language, right? How does that work? What are we seeing? What are we hearing when we're reading a text? What are there multiple perspectives? Is this story just being told from one perspective, or are there others that are involved? What are we talking? First person, second person, third person, omniscient? What's the narrator doing here? whose insights do we have? Whose voices are missing? What form is this text? What genre? How is metaphor being used? What's the tone? How's time being used? What's the diction? Is it formal? Is it bureaucratic? Is it breezy? Is there a dialect being used in this text? How do you recognize the dialect by the words? Where do they come from? And what's the mood? How does the text make you feel after reading it? And what's the mood of the text itself? Right? Those don't have to necessarily be the same thing. So a close reader can identify all those elements when it comes to a text. So I know we got about 5 folks on here, including me, I think. But I'm hoping maybe we could do a little bit of close reading in this part of the program. So, but before we get to that, I encourage all our medical learners to be curious about illness narratives. We share a lot of illness narratives in our classes. There's a number of ones that I learned in graduate school that Peggy's probably read as well. There's a selection from Cancer in Two Voices by two ladies, and I can't remember their names right now. Barbara Rosenblum, I think, is one of them. Sandy Butler. Yeah, I think that's right. Great text from the 80s. I would highly recommend it, which talks about how difficult Barbara's a patient with cancer. She talks about how her body becomes kind of unrecognizable and unpredictable. And we share that with students, and they're blown away every time they read it. Because it begins with a doctor kind of saying, well, these are side effects from chemo, et cetera, et cetera. And then she gets talking about what it's really like. And it's very intimate and raw. And the students are just kind of flabbergasted. I think would be one word to describe it. Anyway, we want students to be more acquainted with those texts, add them to their libraries, both kind of in their heads and on their shelves, in terms of being familiar with different ways of experiencing illness. And that I think will help them become more open to the individual patient sitting in front of them. Maybe their story isn't exactly like Barbara's, but that's okay. They may have heard a similar story, i.e. Barbara's, in the past, and that can help them perhaps relate and seek deeper insights from the patient. So I want to take a few minutes. Maybe you've been reading it while I've been talking already, and kind of get your thoughts on this piece. If somebody wants to kind of unmute themselves, kind of what are your impressions of this piece in terms of any lines that stand out to you? Feel free to use the chat if you can't unmute. Great. So Susan said, never take anything for granted. Enjoy the smallest things life offers. Well put. Other thoughts? The images stand out to you?
In The Taste of Tea, one of the things I've heard from people undergo chemotherapy is the mouth getting raw and not being able to taste things, and that tactile experience changes everything. Because when we think about food and what it represents to us, we have Thanksgiving next week, and we talk about what are we going to prepare for our meal and who's coming to join us, and then you lose that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it connects with what Susan just said about not taking things for granted, and the ways in which the body can all of a sudden kind of rebel against you, especially after taking chemotherapy, which can be so destructive of so many things. And to share that, share that experience with food. Doesn't taste the same. It tastes awful. Tea has lost its bland water now. All those kinds of sensory experiences that give us pleasure or nourish us in various ways are often taken for granted and not understood. How, I think, on the side of the healthcare professionals, sometimes they don't understand how profound these losses are. And poems like this, I think, introduce us to that idea again. Other thoughts? Pen taste. Yes, I've heard that. Wow. Yeah. Learn to drift and sip. The smallest things are gifts. I think that last line is just so powerful. It makes you kind of reflect on those small things. There's another poem called Otherwise by Jane Kenyon that I often teach to students. And they, for the most part, not 100%, of course, are fairly young and fairly in good shape, roughly. Now, you can't assume, of course, but her poem Otherwise talks about some of these small gifts and how one day it will be otherwise, and tries to get the reader to imagine all those things that we take for granted, which, again, this poem does a wonderful job of outlining as well. And how illness is a reversal of expectations. Often it comes without our knowing or expecting it. She never thought she'd be bald at 44. Well, of course, right? But there's a lesson there, I think, that can be drawn and then taken, hopefully, into the clinic. So yeah, thanks so much for your thoughts on this piece. So we talked about reading. We'll talk a little bit more. I'll talk a little bit more about telling. So healthcare professionals write every day, normally in an electronic medical record. There's a lot of copy and paste, of course, but we encourage them to write in other spaces. One of our pathway courses involves a clinical diary that students take as they're kind of going through their day, pausing to write brief notes to themselves or brief reflections on patient encounters. And we use that material to form the basis for stories and teach them how to write scenes and characters and things like that. So that's just part of the ways in which we try to integrate some of the clinical encounters into their learning. But we see writing as not just a way to communicate, but a way to perceive. Sharon talks about not really knowing how she feels about a patient or patient encounter until she's written it out, until she's written down what's happened to her, and as a form of thinking through. So we want medical learners to take some time to process these encounters and not just let them be filtered out by the other tasks that they have to take care of during the day. So we tell stories for a number of reasons. To put difficult experiences into words can help us process them, as I mentioned. This is true for physicians. It's also true for patients. It's true pretty much for anyone. And the form of the story helps us organize those experiences through time, space, desires, and frame. So how the story is constructed. And there's a desire always plays a strong role in any good story, right? Characters want something. They're driven by some need. And how they go about trying to get that, whatever that is the root of the conflict. So reestablishment, sometimes after traumatic experience, either witnessing death or witnessing, catastrophic illness or just any kind of tragedy that might befall anyone, or experiencing it yourself, like I said. There's often a feeling out of step with community. There's a wonderful story called The Aquarium by Alexander Hemon. that talks about his child who had brain cancer, and feeling like the title of the story gets its title from this feeling of being in an aquarium where they're living this trauma and this tragedy over a number of days, and yet life goes on around them. No one, except for their doctor, seems to know that this is what they're going through. So it kind of feels like they're isolated from community and isolated from others who are just going about their day. So telling that story might have been a way to kind of reestablish connection with community and try to make meaning out of what is an ultimately tragic and horrific experience for that family. And then there's an opportunity for catharsis, for working through some of those emotions and trying to release them from that particular traumatic event. So one way to do that is through a 55-word story, which really kind of trims down and tightens the frame on a particular event. I'll read this one aloud because it's just so powerful. White lies. The little girls were barely hurt in the head-on collision. One parent was DOA, the other in critical condition. I was forbidden to provide details until the chaplain arrived. The older girl feigned bravery for her sister. Is my dad okay? He's in surgery. And my mom? I swallowed hard. They're doing all they can. So 55 words and just absolutely devastating and heartbreaking. But this is a way that the physician in this case was able to process some of the emotionally draining aspects of her work. So she says, the practice of medicine can be emotionally draining, and I use my 55-word stories as an outlet. They allow me to work through my feelings about difficult patient interactions. They assist me in making sense of a world that often seems unfair, and they help me define my own role as a physician within that world. So here we have kind of formulation, reestablishment, and catharsis, one would hope, all in one very tight package. So it's a challenge to write these stories, not just emotionally, but technically. So we offer writing workshops for all kinds of writers. And we've done that for several years now that are open to the Texas Medical Center community. So we've got students, residents, and faculty, and office staff, administrators, all kinds of folks from all over the nurses, from all over the TMC come and attend our writing workshops. We often have an outside creative writing facilitator from the University of Houston join us, sometimes working with our colleagues at Imprint, which is a local literary arts organization. And they get 9 hours of craft lectures. This particular sequence that I'm talking about happened in 2021 and 2022. We were able to cover the expenses through a grant that we got from the American Association of Medical Colleges, or the AAMC. And that allowed us to not just provide these writing workshops, which we hope to do again in the future, but to study them. So what we found when we interviewed the folks who participated in our workshops, our storytellers, is that they expressed gratitude for the time that they were given to write and to share. Gratitude also for the opportunity to work through their experiences of caring and work through their experiences of being, a person in the pandemic. This is at the height, 2021, as I mentioned, 2022. Felt a sense of community not possible in other settings when we were all kind of isolated and trying to protect ourselves from each other, as it were. And they experienced some improvements in their mental health related to these habits of self-reflection and connection with others. So it was a good opportunity, I think, for them to experience community, to build a writing community, to process some of these feelings. It didn't result in a reduction in burnout. Our sample size was very small, but you can see there were still some obvious positive effects. So this is a program that we have ongoing, and we're very proud of it. We've been doing this since 2016. This is Off Script. It's our biannual storytelling event. And so it's as I mentioned, it's an ongoing opportunity for folks in the TMC and beyond. We open this up to not just healthcare providers, but patients. We had a high school basketball coach, I think, join us one time. We've had artists and all kinds of folks that are not, connected to the TMC in any direct way participate in this workshop. And basically what happens is we send out a call for story submissions, story ideas, sketches about 600, 900 words. We review those, and then if we accept your story, we accept about 7 each time. We have a writing workshop where the storyteller gets to present their work and have critical feedback from their peers and from the faculty facilitators like myself. And then they do a dress rehearsal a couple weeks later, where they get to practice reading the story out loud, and they get some help from faculty and others on their performance, thinking about diction and elocution and all that fun stuff. How to protect your voice, those kinds of basic kind of theater type skills, public speaking skills. And then they present it on stage, their stories. And it's fascinating. I love it every single time, watching this kind of germ of a story blossom into a majestic oak tree, if you will. Just the wonderful progress and evolution that these stories make over time as they get feedback from the community, they get feedback from, faculty, writer, or folks who have experience with writing. And it just turns into something just wonderful. Or we just had our last one a week ago. So the next one will be in April. If you're interested, just email me. I'm happy to send you the flyer once we put one out. The idea is that we're focusing on the craft of writing and the performance of stories, which are kind of two different things. One, the story as it appears on the page will always be different when it's heard by an audience, especially because they don't have the story in front of them. So if they miss a word here or there, they miss a sentence, a concept, it's lost. So we really home in on performance there. It's super important. All right, so I've talked about reading, I've talked about telling, and I've talked a little bit about sharing. I want to talk about sharing in kind of a different way. I want to talk about it in terms of what I mentioned before, this kind of co-construction of the patient's story. So these are what Sharon identifies as the 4 divides. These are areas in medicine and thinking about health and illness that are sometimes characterized by different points of view between physicians and patients. So in terms of mortality, these are kind of general observations that patients sometimes see their physicians, who tend to be younger, but not always, as removed from the question of mortality. They represent health to the patients, so they don't think about their physicians, kind of their own frailties and illnesses often. And physicians may believe that they're somehow immune from questions of mortality because through their training, they're immersed in death and dying. And that's just part of the training. In fact, it starts, as you're probably familiar with, by dissecting a cadaver. It starts with death, the first patient. And whether death means defeat or a mistake, it's something went wrong and the patient died. Even in cases where that doesn't seem to be true, death is often perceived as a defeat. In terms of context of illness, physicians sometimes narrow, as we've kind of talked about a little bit, they reduce illness to biological phenomena and are not open to the idea of how these illnesses may be influenced by healthcare access or social determinants of health, like access to food and exercise and mental health resources and things of that nature. And so by reducing kind of illness to just biological phenomena, they miss some of these really important contextual elements that could contribute to improving health. So that can happen sometimes. And then disease causality. Patients often have different ideas about what caused disease than physicians, and it's obviously related to some of that reductionism I just talked about. And these ideas are not always reducible to evidence-based medicine, so that you create a kind of disconnect with what the physician thinks caused the disease and what the patient thinks caused it. And like I said, that creates a gap where the physician's knowledge is more valued, which may make them less likely to make patients less likely to speak up when asked, what they think caused their illness. And then emotional resonance, shame, guilt, blaming self or others or circumstances, and fear around their illness may make patients hesitant to share, and then physicians are hesitant to inquire because they don't want to maybe cause some emotional upset, and then they don't ask about how the patient's feeling about their illness. But we think stories can help bridge these gaps, and particularly this idea of joint construction of the story. So if you've ever been a patient, this may characterize your experience or it may not. But patients who often seek care have symptoms that they can't figure out what to do with. Something has happened that has disrupted their normal lives, all the things they took for granted, going back to our earlier conversation. And they want an explanation and treatment. They seem to be saying in some ways, can you help me to tell a better story about what's happening to me? One that's not frightening and one that makes sense, one that will cause me less distress about this experience. Howard Brody refers to this as the question, my story is broken, can you help me fix it? So in simple words, the body may be broken, but the story is also broken. And it's both broken at the same time. The loss of meaning, the confusion around what's happening, the fear, all of that creates a break, a gap in the patient's narrative of their lives. And so when the body can't be healed, which sometimes happens, we encourage medical learners to try to heal the story by trying to figure out how can they help the patient, if the patient wants them to, make meaning of the illness. And some patients may say, I'm just here for medication, doc, send me on my way. And others may ask questions like, why has this happened to me? What did I do wrong? How could this have happened? All those kinds of questions that the doc needs to be open to hearing, and then open to offering some support and perhaps some guidance if it's wanted. So this is the kind of idea of symbolic healing. First, giving the patients a satisfactory explanation. This is what I think is happening to you. And this is why I think that. And providing them with care and concern, listening to them, letting them feel heard, hoping that they feel heard, but at least trying to hear them. And then returning a sense of control over their own story, if they can. Again, these are challenges to be met, not simple solutions to complex problems, but there has to be a willingness to enter into the patient's story, an invitation first, and then a willingness to help them make meaning out of their illness experience. And it's very important. So how are we doing this at HEAL? Well, we've started to work on a program called My Life, My Story. This is a national program that's already been going on for many years in the VA system and in other places, other academic medical centers around the US. Started in Madison by a resident who was interested in learning more about their patients. Kind of a good place to start, I think. So the idea is that a medical learner will sit at the bedside and talk to the patient and ask them questions, not about their illness, but about their childhood, their relationships, their occupation, what legacy they want to leave, those kinds of things. Questions about who they are as people, not about, the antibiotic that they're taking and whether they're taking it or not. Those kinds of questions. They're really trying to get to know them and asking them about their life story. Again, obviously this doesn't happen unless the patient gives permission. then they take those notes from the interview, turn them around into a first-person story, and then share that story with the patient. You know, did I get this right? You said that you were born in New Mexico in 1959. Your wife's name is, but it would all be from the patient's perspective. So I was born in New Mexico in 1959. My wife is, etc. So the idea would be that the patient gets to hear their own story reflected back to them. They get a copy of it, and if there's errors, there's things that they said but don't want to be in the story for whatever reason, and then the student makes the changes and gives them the final copy. And at the VA, there's a way for this story to get into the medical chart, which I think is fantastic, because then others can, who weren't there for the storytelling, can learn more about their patient. And you can imagine, the patient comes in sometime, they're unconscious, unable to tell their story. Maybe they are in the ICU and have a breathing tube in their mouth and can't talk. Their story can talk for them, which I think has a lot of opportunity for growth as we move more towards personalized medicine. This might be a really important first step. So we're working on trying to get this program established at BenTaub, and hopefully in the next few months. So what other programs do we have? We have Wednesday School. This is our program for internal medicine residents, where they get some exposure to medical humanities. We have a medical humanities pathway. The students take 4 courses, leading to a certificate. We have an Art of the Human Body elective, where students spend time at the Museum of Fine Arts. And brand new for this year, this is an idea that came to us from a student, which is fantastic. But this is a year-long course. Each month, the students get to talk to a patient who has an illness that's related to the organ system they're studying. So a patient with heart disease during the cardiovascular unit, and that kind of thing. It's been really interesting so far to hear these stories. A little bit more about us, faculty-wise. Well, you've met me and listening to me, hopefully, for the last hour, so you probably know a little bit more about me. But here are my colleagues, my wonderful colleagues. Ricardo Nuila is a hospitalist. He wrote a book called People's Hospital about caring for patients at BenTaub. Stacy Nigliazzo is a ER nurse. She's now an administrator. She was an ER nurse for 20 years. And she's a poet. She's published several books of poetry. Burke Nixon is a communications, teaches courses in communications. He's a writer as well. It's essays mainly at Rice, and he helps us with our teaching. Actually, all 4 of us teach in various aspects of HEAL, the pathway, the electives, and so forth. All right. So I hope that you've learned more about what HEAL does and how important storytelling is in medicine. We think that it should be a two-way street in terms of storytelling back and forth between patients and physicians, and open to the community as well. Community's voice is always important. Learning more about reflective and creative writing opportunities and how we've integrated them into medical education, and thinking about just in general, medicine being a storytelling enterprise. So I think we got maybe 4 minutes for questions if there are any. Oh, Susan, I love that question. What's your secret to longevity? That's cool.
So I teach pre-meds medical ethics at the University of Houston, and I've been teaching the students, and when they get to the eventuality of leading family meetings, instead of starting with your mom has this and this and this, what do you want us to do, of starting with the simple, tell me about your mom.
Yeah.
And as I tell them, my hope is, even though they're not in the clinic right now, that this will stay with them. And when they get to the clinic, that they'll remember that the person is always at the center of whatever the medical condition is.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I wish more physicians kind of thought that way. Because the tendency is to go in there, those family meetings are tough, especially if it's an ethics related family meeting. It can be very challenging. And the tendency is to, yeah, here's a clinical update, not even like, this is why we wanted to talk to you today. What do you want to get out of this meeting? All that kind of preparatory stuff you're supposed to be doing. But just rattling off some clinical information. It's like, whoa, let's take a step back. It's
half the words they're not going to understand anyway.
Yep.
I play the heart attack card. What are all the different words for heart conditions? Heart attack, MI, myocardial infarction, congestive heart failure, yada, 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 yada.
Yeah. Well, and then, in my practice, what I always try to do is, as an ethicist, is to go in and have a huddle with the team beforehand and say, all right, folks, what are we going to talk about? Who's going to lead the meeting? How are we going to open it? And then that gives them an opportunity to say, all right, maybe we should ask those questions to start with, and then get into what we want to talk about.
Yeah.
Goals of care. 90% of the time it's goals of care.
Oh yeah. But that should come further down, because if you ask a family, the goal is going to be, we want you to fix them.
Yeah.
Because that's your job.
Right. Especially if it's, you broke them, now you fix them.
Yeah.
Which I've heard.
Susan had a question, or had her hand up.
Oh, did she?
Susan.
Good afternoon. No, I just want to say thank you. This was very informative.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you could join. Thank you. Thank you for your thoughts and comments. And that question about longevity, I like that. I think I'm gonna have to put that in there in the interview guide for our students.
Did you watch, perchance, the lecture at UT last year, the Carmela Dyer Memorial Lecture? I'll send the link to you. It's on, they saved it on Vimeo or something, but it was a gentleman, a physician, geriatrician, and palliative care doc out of New York. And he talked about the things that contribute to longevity that have nothing to do with diet and exercise.
Wow.
It's just a fantastic. And Jason Burnett at UT has gotten funding for a Center for Social Connection. And he recruits students and matches them up with individuals, elderly individuals who I won't say are completely unbefriended or mostly unbefriended. And there's some different efforts going on. I'm working with a Rice student, and we match up students at Rice with some of our clients here at the Hope and Healing Center, and they meet for several weeks during a semester and help them write their life stories.
That is cool. That is amazing. I love that.
And so in fact, Angelo will be speaking, and I'll let you know when that happens, because you can maybe tune in or watch the recording. He's going to be in October. We're going to kind of talk about how we got this started and the progress that we've had. And both sides, the students are loving it, and the seniors are loving it.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed chatting with you all and sharing kind of what we're doing.
Thank you for your time, because I've been watching you, because I'm on the mailing list, and I'm not embarrassed to say I'm stealing some ideas to work in with our senior narrative stuff.
Go for it. Yeah.
Because that's, my students will eventually end up in your program, and I hope that they'll build on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Spread the word. That's what I say.
Because you and I share that passion from our own educational backgrounds.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Those were good years, Peggy. Good years.
Well, they were traumatic years. They were anxiety inducing, but I'm glad you found a home, and I'm glad that Heal is feeding your soul.
Oh yeah, definitely. Thanks
Um,
so much. Y'all have a good day.
thank you
Appreciate
so
it.
much.